Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pax East Online. I'm Harry Loizides, and I'm excited to have you here with us today. With me are Zack Hartzman and Adam Mills, and we plan to explore a dilemma that a lot of teachers have been dealing with for years. So let's answer that question. Can we finally admit that games should be in the classroom? So this might be a great time to introduce ourselves. So let's get started with Zack. So if you want, you could introduce yourselves with name, content area, um, years teaching, favorite game, stuff like that.
Sure. What's going on, everyone? I'm Zack Hartzman. I'm a high school teacher in New York City. I teach high school social studies in the Bronx. Specifically, I teach high school social studies and English as a second language because my high school is a 100% newly arrived immigrant population to the city who move here and basically start high school over in order to graduate and learn English as a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth language. Some of my students are very multilingual. And I am also the founder of Hey Listen Games. It's a website that I made a couple years ago now, basically providing all of my game-based learning curriculum, all of my lesson plans, my curriculum for teaching with video games. I incorporate video games a lot into my typically my social studies classes over the years, but I also occasionally teach an ELA elective, or I also have an advisory class every year. So I do history lessons, social emotional learning lessons, English language arts lessons, and all I put all of my curriculum online for anyone for free. We'll talk about more about that later, of course. And I was recently, this past 2020 Game Awards, I was recognized as part of the future class for the Game Awards for my work. Thank you to my wife for nominating me. I know it was because of her. And it's been really cool. And I'm currently going into my seventh year of teaching. Eighth year at the
Awesome.
school because I'm teaching at the school that I student taught at. I did my student teaching there. I vibed with it. My principal liked me, and I just kind of stuck around since.
Now that's awesome, Zack. Thank you so much. Now let's bring it to Adam. Adam, let's hear what you have to say.
My name's Adam Mills. I am a high school special education teacher in Nassau County. I've been teaching for about 17 years now. I started my career as a social studies teacher, bouncing around before working for 5 years in New York City public schools. 10 years ago, came out to Nassau County and moved over to becoming a special education history teacher. I hold a master's degree in special education, as well as a master's degree in educational technology. Also a lifelong geek. I play some video games. Also am a big fan of board games and RPGs, as well as other aspects of kind of pop culture, geek culture. I also have written and self-published a children's book called You Are Your Own Superhero, because you are. And I'm a father of two awesome young boys, and looking forward to discussing how we can better incorporate games and gaming and gamification into the educational space, and move forward to a place where that's accepted and helping kids to not only achieve but thrive.
Thank you so much, Adam. Now I'm also super excited to chat about that.
Also,
Uh,
this is this
so
is this is being recorded on Father's Day, so happy Father's Day, Adam.
yeah, happy Father's
Oh,
Day.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
from
you.
the past, we're saying this, and also in the future, happy Father's Day, and it is every day. So especially today. So I'm Harry Loizides. This is my 7th year teaching. I mostly teach middle and high school. Now it's mostly focused on high school math, but I've taught a wide variety between 7th grade math all the way up to senior level classes. Um, I also teach at the same school with Adam, so it's been great to collaborate with another fellow geeky person to discuss opportunities to bring non-traditional, which we hope will eventually be traditional learning with games, geek culture, and other opportunities for students to explore the ideas instead of just rote memorization and because I said so rules. In terms of video games, I've always been a Nintendo fan. I recently joined the PlayStation Nation with the PlayStation 4, and I got an Xbox One S last year because Game Pass is so freaking good, guys, which is a really awesome opportunity just to kind of explore games that you haven't seen before. In addition to that, I've also gotten a bunch of grants for my proposals in trying to get more games and more technology in the classrooms. I've gotten a few grants from a few honor societies and a few other like banks and other locations like that. And we'll talk more about those down the line in this session. But I'm super excited that we got chosen to chat about this because it's really a great idea and stepping point that we're implementing our content with the standards that we need to do, plus talk about the things that we like outside of our educational foundations. Because we all love the content we're teaching, but we also love video games, and why not, and tabletops and everything. So why not just blend them all together? Because especially that'll give students opportunity to remember the knowledge, not just remember it because I said so, and then we move on and forget everything. So that's our intros. Thank you so much, guys. So in terms of our panel, we pretty much have three main goals that we want to address. The first one is that we want to make sure we integrate meaningful games to content areas. So we're not just doing this for the sake of doing it. We're not just, shoehorning stuff. We're making it meaningful for us and for the students. Our second goal is to offer actual examples of game-based learning and project-based learning, which is, I'm sure, Adam's favorite phrase. Because we're not trying to just be like, well, we could just do this and just call it a day. We're giving you examples that we've either thought of in the past, have been doing, or plan on doing in the future. So it's not just us talking about theoretical stuff. These are on the grounds things that we are doing. And then the third goal that we're doing is we want to provide avenues of support, whether it's ideas for funding, like I mentioned, whether it's websites like Zack mentioned, or whatever we can think of to help you try this out, feel successful, and improve on it in the future. We good?
I believe so.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So let's do, we were going to do a little bit of a micro gaming overview, which we kind of briefly talked about, but if you guys want to just add anything else about how you started using games in the classroom, what sparked any ideas, just so we can get this started and then actually go into our game plans.
Sure. I can get started there. So
Go for it.
basically, when I started teaching, off the bat, I didn't know that I was going to use video games off the bat. But I did know that I specifically wanted to use film and comics in my classes. Every year I make sure to teach with at least one movie and with at least one comic or graphic novel. And those, as like one of the texts as a part of a larger unit, and those parts of my class were always great. I feel like in part because when we bring things that we're passionate about into the classroom, right, those activities tend to be better because like our enthusiasm is kind of contagious and like the kids feed off that. So I use comics and movies and TV shows a lot, and basically after going into my like third year, I was thinking about what else I can do, and I was like, well, I'm also really passionate about video games. I'm more passionate about video games than I am movies or comics. I love those. I love both of those, but like when I go home, I'm playing games. So I started thinking about different ways that I could bring games into my classroom, and I started off pretty simple, using it's a web browser game called The Republia Times, developed by Lucas Pope. He's also the developer of Papers, Please, Return of the Obra Dinn, those more well-known games. The Republia Times was one of his earlier games, and I used it in the middle of a unit I was teaching about propaganda leading up to World War II. And it's basically, in this game, it puts you in the shoes of a like propaganda minister. You control the headlines that go out on your nation's newspaper, and it's basically you initially need to start by choosing headlines that make your government look good, even though it's clearly very corrupt. And then you need to build loyalty amongst the populace. But then as you play, a rebellion gets in contact with you, and they want you to make the government look bad. So it's all about manipulating newspaper headlines. We played the game and then compared it to like actual newspaper headlines were coming out at the time of what we were studying in class, and it was awesome. It was clear. It was one of the best days of that year, and I knew like immediately I knew that it worked. Specifically because when I very rarely, if like I never really use any games that are educational, quote unquote. Like those can have a place, but the games I'm using are games like they're entertainment games. These are games that were made to be fun, that I'm just kind of bringing in as an added text to whatever we're doing, right? So I like to use a movie, I like to use a comic. I'm still going to use all the primary resources and nonfiction text, but I'm also going to bring in a game to a lot of the stuff that we're doing just as another added thing for students to engage with. And the second that lesson went well, I was like, okay, I'm going to start doing this a lot more. And I started, well, first I went to my principal. I was like, I'm thinking about doing this. And she was perfectly on board. She saw how good the comic book and movie lessons were going. So she was like, I trust you. Just show me like the lesson plan. So I started making tons of lesson plans and tons of curriculum, which is now why I have so much available online. And I just like over the years have started using games more and more and more and more to the point where I use them in my history class, but I also now teach an ELA elective specifically focused at analyzing video games as literature, the same way that they do any book or poem or short story or movie in their ELA classes. We're just with a focus on video games as literature, which has been really cool.
Awesome. Yeah, and I definitely agree that with the video games, it's not just all right, we're only going to talk about the video, and we're going to you did a great job of kind of articulating the fact that it's another medium that we can explore themes and motifs and applications, and it's absolutely a fun factor, but it's also it can be way deeper than
exactly.
that.
It's not a replacement. I'm not replacing this like the other stuff that we're already doing. It's just here's another cool thing that we can use.
Right.
Definitely. Yeah, I like that. As you just said, using video games as or graphic novels or film as ways to enrich the content, which I think people outside of the educational space may not. You as the father, if your kid comes home and says, "Yeah, we watched a movie in class today," you may not necessarily understand if you're not in it that what role does that actually play, and how that can be used to deepen understandings and connections that students are making, and that's just film. These kids are digital natives. Zach, I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm guessing you're probably closer in age to Harry than to me. I'm a few years older than you guys.
Yeah, you're old.
Yeah, I know, but still the best looking of all three of us.
Okay.
I won't fight you there.
But I think that's a really important point to make, is that at least my generation, and I would say most likely you guys to a certain degree too, are digital immigrants. You grew up not immersed in the types of technology we have today. You had to learn them as they came out, and as did I. I can remember the first desktop computer we owned as a family. I remember when we got dial-up, and what a huge thing that was, and I remember what the original Nintendo coming out, and then SNES coming out, and how different that looked, and how much more advanced it got over the years. These kids are natives to those things. So to bring in video games as an enrichment tool, as another level, and I love that you use the word video games as text, because they are. Text, traditionally people think of it as the printed word on the page, but we've known for years now in education that that's not the case. It's it is also film, it's radio, it's podcasts are out there that can be extraordinarily transformative. So why not video games? Why not use those as a text to further inform student understandings and connection?
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And especially for me, I definitely am all about engaging students. That's pretty much one of my main tenets as an educator, just because if they're not interested in what I'm talking about, it's going to tune out and they don't want to listen to it. So for me, it's all about figuring out what their interests are, how it relates to the topics, and how it can be further understood. I actually am a little bit of a similar boat as Zach in terms of I was able to gently encourage my administration to make a game theory class, which we did this year. It was super successful. If I do want to pat myself on the back, where
Mhm.
it engaged students not only on tabletop games but more traditional games like Guess Who and Tic Tac Toe, and talked about the variety of games like sequential um, and a bunch of other types where we're doing it almost as thirds. One third of it is playing the games. One third of it is talking about the theories and stuff, and the one third of it is all about the math. So we're kind of getting a nice mixture with those students to kind of get them invested in it and not only use it for this classroom, but if they play a game next year or 5 years down the road, they'll be able to, you know, pick up a few things and kind of be like, well, the probability of this is probably going to be way more than probability of this, and like those deductive reasoning skills can really be helpful for students. And especially with me, I started off super simple. I didn't go from 0 to 90 in one day and be like, well, I'm an expert. You start with the stuff like everyone likes playing Jeopardy or math bingo, or which is pretty much bingo, but just solve for math problems, or
Mhm.
warm up or exit tickets to get the students into something.
Mhm.
And it's all about getting them more comfortable. If I try saying, all right, we're going to play a video game for 3 weeks and then we're going to have a test, that's not I don't think that's a successful way of just blurting it out. So having everything with a meaning, and we'll talk about making it work in a minute, but having some forethought as well, kind of like with Zach with the curriculum writing, or with
Mhm.
Adam and being like, well, they're already engrossed in it. Let's just kind of dive right into what they're already familiar with. And plus, who doesn't want to talk about video games and like nerdy stuff in class? Because there's definitely those students that are super quiet or don't have that avenue elsewhere, and they want to, and they're going to get that exposure, and maybe you'll get another perspective from a student that you weren't aware of.
Well, I think it's also important. I mean, you did a great job of mentioning. I think I don't know how many teachers out there are using games to the extent that we are, but many I think start with the kind of those gateway drugs that you just spoke about, like using Jeopardy as a review tool. Or when I first started, they were still you could buy the little buttons that you could team off the students and do a Jeopardy style question and answer review game, and the teams could push the buttons and it would light up, and they loved that. And yeah, exactly that. And I think, Zach, you made a good point of it too, is making a decision to incorporate these things and then slowly finding the path to making it work.
Mm-hmm.
Harry, as you said, if you were to just say, okay, yeah, I'm going to use video games to teach math, or video games to teach history, or video games to teach science. Okay, all the time?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
also want, and it's also not good teaching like patterns to just say, I'm just going to do this. Well, why? Because it's cool, or because I
Yeah.
said so. Like that's not good teaching practices. So having the reasoning and justification on, okay, here's my rationale, here's my learning objective, here's my like thought process, goes a long way, not only to explain it to people who might not be familiar with video games, but it also internalizes the behavior for yourself to be like, all right, so if I do it this way, this is how it's going to be successful, or in a perfect world, actually, this is how it could be successful. Um,
Mhm.
but
So, and Adam, you mentioned that you weren't sure like how many people are actually
Mm,
using games to the extent that we are. So,
mm,
it's obviously still like in the grand scheme of all like schools and teachers and students in the country or the world, it's obviously not a crazy amount, but it is a very rapidly growing practice. And I only
mm,
know this because for any teachers watching, like you don't need to love social media or Twitter, but like getting active on Twitter was a very important decision I made, and getting into contact with like thousands of teachers. And I know for a fact, even like my curriculum, people contact me all the time about the lessons that they're trying, that I've put out there. So I know that a lot of people are now, especially with esports becoming a bigger thing. That's a whole other conversation with esports in schools, but like it is rapidly becoming more common and more accepted. It's still an uphill battle in many different ways, but it is like we're seeing it grow just in like Like we saw in the past like 5 years, like comics and graphic novels exploded in popularity in schools these like past
Yes.
5 years. And I feel like in this next 5 years to 10 years, we're going to start seeing the exact same thing with video games and games in general.
Uh,
Well,
and I was just going to say, and not to put my math nerd hat on, but I was taking a grad class recently, and one of the articles, which was from the early 1990s, which I immediately scoffed at because I was just annoyed at that fact. But it talked about the paradigm shift between not using graphing calculators and then using graphing calculators. So, and that's not even a forethought in my classrooms now. It's just you just use it. But that was a
mhm.
real heated debate. So fast forward 30 years, now we're having this kind of renaissance of video games and conversations around that. So probably in 15, 20 years, it's just going to eventually be the more socially acceptable thing. And we're just going to be like, well, of course we're teaching with video games. Why wouldn't we? Like, how
Mhm.
do you not do that? So it's just
Well,
some
and
little sprinkles of that.
I wanted to add to or respond to a couple of things that Zach just said. First, yes, social media can be tough, but I do think that using Twitter in particular to grow your personal learning network and your connections within the teaching community, especially around uh, specific ways of teaching or things that you're trying to do, Twitter can be an amazing thing. Again, I one of my masters is in educational technology, and as part of that, I started my professional Twitter handle. And before that, I had had a private Twitter handle and had not found much use for it. Um, going the route that Zach just mentioned, finding the community, the digital community that's going through the same struggles and growing pains and leaps forward and you know interesting discoveries that you are is an amazing way to use a tool that uh, a lot of the time ends up being a very negative place. um, and Zach, I agree with you. I think that in the next 5-10 years we're going to see massive movement forward in the use of games. I think there's been companies that have tried recently and recently in the last 5 or 10 years, um, through what they would have called gamification. The use of
That's a whole
uh,
separate thing, which people.
yeah,
So
and
I feel like we might need to clarify
yeah,
because I get questions or people think what I do a lot of time is
is
gamification,
gamification.
and I don't deal with gamification at all. Gamification
Yeah,
is more like gamifying your learning environment and making
yeah,
the environment into a game, like stats
yeah,
and rewards and skills and whatnot. Whereas like
exactly.
I'm just teaching with video games. I just bring in games, we play them, we study them, we analyze them. It's very, 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 very different things. This is more like game-based learning.
Mm-hmm.
But that's yeah. My point was to say exactly that I think that will, because gamification has been tested somewhat and to varying degrees of success, just the fact that people are beginning to think along the lines of incorporating
Hmm.
a game style into education. If you took if a new teacher took a class in undergrad that talked about that, and then they see your materials and begin to say, oh wait, gamification, I got, all right, it was okay and I kind of understood it, but I do love video games and that could also be part of my teaching. I think we're going to start to see a sea change moving forward, with the utilization.
So speaking of those changes, let's actually dive right into kind of the points that we want to make on. So how do you make this work? I think we outlined 7 of these, so we're going to go one by one, and then we'll interject any thoughts as we go through that. So I think the most important thing that we need to address is you need to plan. You can't just go in, like I said before. Let's play Overwatch for a week and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's a great club activity, but you want to go in with an idea, with a goal, or with some sort of preparation. I don't know if this is the norm, but I usually plan or at least have a general frame of what I want to do throughout the year, with like a week by week game plan before the year starts, so that I can implement some subtle changes or give myself cushion so that if I have an idea, I can do it and not be already ruined for this year because of my timing of everything. So what do you guys think about planning? How do you plan with these? Do you try implementing it like a crazy man like me and doing it a year in advance, or you kind of give yourself some cushion and sprinkle it in as you go?
So I usually have like a yearly skeleton um, before it starts, but I'm also very much like a day by day, maybe week by week kind of person. Where like I usually the night before I'll be brainstorming some ideas, and then I'm putting together. And so I usually go to work early, and then I'll like put together my lesson when there's no teachers in the building and the photocopy machine isn't taken. Um, so I'm historically like that. Although like I know I have the idea of what I'm doing,
Right.
but I don't have all like the nitty gritty really until like the day or the week of. Um, but when it comes to like games, it's usually like I know what the unit is going to be, so then I just think about all the things that I've played and what what could fit. It's not like I usually don't go searching for a game that could
Hmm.
fit, but I also like that's also just because I play games constantly and I have a vast library already like available on my own that I can reference and find connections to and it with what I'm already teaching. So it's somewhat backwards design. Like I know the endpoint I want to get, and then I think about what text, what games do I already have that I can find a way to bring in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You used the terminology that I was going to use, the backwards design, right?
Mm.
That's, I think many of us have been trained in, and the reason for that is it tends to be effective. But Zach, I would wonder too if you experience the same thing I do on the ESL side of things. You know, when as a special ed teacher, what you said mirrors a lot of what I go through as well. You know, yeah, I have my curriculum, I have my kind of major points I need to hit as I go throughout the year, but depending on the population, every day could be different.
Yeah. So I guess I should preface with like so I mentioned all of my students are non-native English speakers, right? And I have students who so I teach 11th and 12th grade, so they're either in their third or their fourth year, and some students by that time are fluent in speaking English but not in writing English by any means, or they're fluent in writing but not in speaking, or they're fluent in both, or not at all, or just like every varying degree in the middle. So I this is part of why I don't plan so intensely far ahead of time
Mm-hmm.
because I know it's not going to work. Like I'm going to have to
Right.
change
Yeah.
everything I did, like
Mm-hmm.
per student or per whichever class. It's a I understand that it's a somewhat different experience than teaching in a just like standard mainline classroom.
Yes, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, and that, you know, the special education teaching
Yeah.
experience is very, very similar. But I do also think that the modern classroom has become much more individualized and differentiated. So I think that this will speak to many of the teachers that we're looking to talk to, even in, you know, a general education classroom that, you know, don't teach in a major metropolitan area where there is a large immigrant population or larger special education population. Um, to go back to the original question, you know, though, that is what you take into account when it comes to planning. Yes, we all have our endpoint, our goal. As a history teacher, Zach, I'm sure you kind of go through the same thing of, all right, well, what primary sources do I need to include? You know, what do I need to pull from my library for primary source access? Um, and then how can I utilize a variety of enrichment materials to better speak to my current population? You know, whether that is film, graphic novels, or as we're speaking about here, gaming. Um, and those games might change from year to year, or, you know, month to month, or group to group, um, because the group changes and their needs change and what they're capable of involving themselves with and being successful with changes. So planning not only around the content, but around, in particular, the group of students that you're working with and their needs, I think should should be the driving force with the games you're choosing and the way you're using them.
Awesome. And speaking of choosing and using, let's talk about that second point, which is to start small and then expand gradually. So, as educators, you don't, or at least in my experience, if you're trying something new, do not try something new for the first time for a 3-week PBO. You want to start it as meaningful, concise, and kind of getting your point to test out your knowledge of the content as well as the student's understanding of what you're asking so that you can kind of course correct and start reflecting as a teacher, be like, okay, this didn't go well. How can I fix it for next time? Whether it's a warm-up activity or just a one-word problem that you want to explore a concept. At least for math, I might do something with probability and relate to a game that they're playing or an idea that they might understand that is contained. Or it's even a writing prompt where you're just like, okay, choose any, and you don't even have to specify video games, choose any literary item or text. And that elicited a negative emotion from you or something like that. So what do you guys think about starting gradually?
I mean, yeah, like I mentioned, like the first time I used the game or a video game was with the Republia Times, and the game only takes 15 minutes to finish. And you could play it a number of times, but that was just a 1-day activity. It wasn't some grand unit or a multi-day commitment. It was just, oh, all right, I'm gonna test this out with one class period, and it worked. It's like, okay, cool. Now I know in the future I could set aside more time and planning to do something larger. And in that regard, this is right for like social studies, ELA. Look, especially if you want to use video games as a text or some form like as literature, kind of like how I do. Look towards indie games because I'd say 95% of the games I use are 2 to 4 hours long. And recently we've had like this decade is a renaissance of indie games. Indie games now are just spectacular, and there's so many good ones coming out. And I found that those are the easiest and the most manageable ones to bring in. Like the common question that I always get asked is, "Oh, do you use Assassin's Creed? Should I try using Assassin's Creed?" And I don't like maybe the museum tour, the discovery tour mode looks cool for history classes, but that's like that's not playing a video game really. That's like you're going on a virtual museum tour, which is cool and it has its place, but I'm not going to bring in like the campaign of Assassin's Creed and have students play through the campaign. It's too large, right? That's too much prep time. I can't like play the game, create a save point where I want them to start off and then they play there. There's way too much to manage there. But if you find a good indie game that's only a couple of hours of time dedicated to playing it, then that's a much easier place to kind of dip your toes in the water.
Yeah, and that leans especially into our third point about setting realistic goals and time frames.
Yeah.
Like, don't give students a 6-hour game and you want them to finish it in a day. Like, students have lives too, or you only have 41 minutes in the classroom. You want to make sure it's a meaningful use of their time, not just let's spend 3.5 hours getting to the crutch of my lesson that I'm trying to get to. But then you also want to plan for when things go awry or for some creative solution. Just like with any good teaching practices, you want to kind of anticipate the students' issues and try to mitigate it in a beneficial way, or offer leading questions to kind of get them engaged and kind of refocus them so they don't get so misguided in where you're going. Adam, were you going to say something?
I was just going to add to what you were just talking about planning for things to go awry. We as educators learned a lot about utilizing technology over the last year or so with having to implement distance learning as quickly and hopefully effectively as we did, and we learned a lot about how the speed bumps of technology falling apart on us can really get in the way of everything. When you're using video games, you're adding, I think, an extra level to that because these are now, interactive tools. It's not just, a platform of, Google Classroom or, something like that, where they just need to go in and click a link and open a doc or something like that, or go watch a video on YouTube. Now it's something that they also have to learn and interact with. And that for a lot of them is going to take a lot more time, especially if you're dealing with a population that may have only ever played mobile games or, never played a keyboard game at all.
Right.
That could definitely shift how the gaming goes. So yeah, I think you made an excellent point there about plan for it to fail and have an idea of what you're going to do when it fails.
Right.
I want to quickly touch on a point. So you mentioned like games where students have only played mobile games, or have not played games. A common question or concern that comes up is access to tech, and like what do we actually expect students to have? And for me personally, I don't expect students to have anything, and 90% of the time we play a game together as a class, right? So when we use a video game, kind of use it in the same way we use a film. I project it in the front of the room. I have a student player and then rotate players as needed. But it's important because, one, not every student is going to want to be a player. And a lot of students, right? We see this with YouTube and Twitch streaming. Like, a lot of people love watching people play video games, right? So you don't actually need every single student to be a player. Usually I'm playing together as a class. Occasionally I'll set them up in groups if I have the certain type of laptop computers available. And then if a game is free, like the Republic of Times is free on web browsers. So in that case, then I'll have students with their own copies or in pairs, especially to help with my students because some students might have a higher grasp of English. So, but yeah, most time we're playing together as a class and treat it the same way as we treat a movie. There just happens to be a student who's playing, and then other students can help them get through whatever is happening on screen.
Right. And I think
that's a great way of doing it.
Mobile games are a great resource actually, because it's not like you're playing your mother's mobile games where 20 years ago they were kind of cruddy, but now we still have the cruddy ones, but there are some really fantastic ones like Knights of San Francisco, which is one that I randomly popped and threw $3 at, is a fantastic text adventure game that like blew my mind how good it was in world building. So like you just never know until you start exploring, and there's thousands of them. So
yeah, a quick thing I did with my students last year before we shifted to online was I had about 6 of the students in my elective class who had iPhones get a month free of Apple Arcade, and we played Assemble with Care, right, in groups. And then the second we were done with the game, and those couple of lessons, just cancel description before they paid for anything. So quick little way to start up with a very simple, beautiful little indie game.
Yeah, that's a good pro tip.
Yeah.
So let's go to our next talking point. We want to also, I think Zach mentioned it, like don't just use Assassin's Creed for Assassin's Creed purposes, but you also want to make sure you pair games with content areas that make sense and don't try to shoehorn it. So like with me, I'm not going to just say, well, the Assassin's Creed, they're in Greece, and in Greece they have parabolas. Like you're kind of forcing it a little too much, but you want to make sure it's meaningful. So just saying parabolas in Assassin's Creed doesn't really get your point across. I think Adam, you mentioned a lot of thematics. If you wanted to go into that, I thought that was a really good point. You mentioned before.
Well, and I think it's also important to recognize that, like, to extend what you said there, just because a game is centered around a content doesn't mean that it's good for what you need it to be. Yeah, exactly. Assassin's Creed is a perfect example of that. Or if you're teaching, again, ancient Greece, and you're talking about Greek mythology. Oh yeah, it's centered around Greek mythology, but there's no way you can include that. Back to what Zach said before. But the flip side of that is it doesn't have to be, just because it doesn't have a content connection that you're seeing or immediately making, that doesn't mean that it's not going to work. You can make thematic connections. So in global history and with a lot of the newer standards, we focus on enduring issues. It's more of a thematic teaching approach, and there are a lot of games out there. When I was writing this, I was thinking more tabletop, but many other games would work, and probably because of the, I'm going to use the word, unprecedented times we live in. Uh, I thought of the game Pandemic, and I thought about how that very clearly connects to two of the enduring issues we see in global history: interconnectedness and cooperation. Uh, any co-op game, you could use that as a springboard or as again an enrichment activity to show the impact of cooperation or uh, you know cultural diffusion or uh, conflict or the desire for power, any of these large enduring issues that touch on so many different eras of history. This is another way to show students, especially students who may not be so immersed in the content or so well versed in the content, like students with special needs or students who are learning English as a second language or a third or a new language. Having a game that shows them or connects to these enduring issues or these themes is a lot of times a much different point of access for these kids to the curriculum, and can create a much more meaningful and deep connection for them.
Nice. So let's combine these next two together. So another aspect that we want to focus on is you want to get feedback on what your students are interested in. If they do not like any RPGs, don't use RPGs in the classroom unless you want to sprinkle it in and give them exposure. But you want to listen to what the students are interested in. Otherwise, you're going to lose them right away. And then also, you also want to be a reflective teacher where you want to identify things that went wrong, went right, and how you plan to improve it in the future, whether it's the next lesson, the next unit, or even the next year. That's usually good teaching practices in general. Like you want to identify, how you're doing, and you gotta be honest with yourself. Like when I did my first PBL with trigonometry, I did not think it went very well. I overplayed my hand. I gave the students too much freedom. I didn't give them a scope that was reasonable, so they kind of went all over the place. You want to do that same thing while you're debriefing on video games. Okay, was this video game beneficial? How
Yep.
did the students get the information that I wanted them? Were they able to articulate their reasoning? Were they able to explain it to another students? Those are the questions you need to start asking yourself, which I'm sure a lot of us do in multiple facets. But if we're doing this with a whole new medium of education, we want to make sure that we're hyper focused on building it better so it doesn't fall apart and it's a justification for us not to use it in the future.
Just to add to that one way, and this also goes back to planning, I think, so it's good that we're in, kind of getting to this again. It's a good way to bookend. An acronym that I generally try and remember, and I won't get into the history of it, but for good reflective teaching and a good approach to this is OODA, OODA. And the idea is that you observe how you did, observe the lay of the land. You orient, you ask those reflective questions that Harry was just speaking about. You decide on a new course of action, and then you act. And it's a circular form of reflective teaching and decision making that will constantly, when you start over again, you constantly are taking into account where you're at, what that means, and deciding and moving forward all the time. So just a little
Nice.
mnemonic device for you there.
And then I guess the last thing we want to just close end on.
Very quickly.
Oh, sorry. Go.
Also, for like, this is very good for people, right, who are familiar with games and they kind of know where to start, and then like go through that whole like modify, adapt, change as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
With our students, like uh, reflections on it. Like I always, for example, and I usually do this after any unit, but anytime I use a game, I usually send a student survey, like asking how they think it went, whether or not it's worth repeating with future students, and it's always great to see their thoughts. But also, if you don't know where to start or what games to use. You probably have a lot of experts in the room who might know games that kind of could relate to what you're teaching. So even when we shifted online last year in the middle of March and for that semester, it kind of like I mean, and this did this everyone, but it sidelined the curriculum that I was kind of doing at the time. Um, and I spent a day with that elective class, my video game elective class, and I just asked like, okay, so we kind of can't exactly continue what we were doing before, but do any of you have any ideas or preferences? And a whole bunch of them were like, we want to play a superhero game. It's like, okay, and do you have any recommendations? And one student told me that Batman the Telltale series
Yes.
could be a cool thing to try, given it's a mature game, but my students are older, so not exactly solid for middle school. But one student mentioned that game. I hadn't played it yet, although I'm familiar with Telltale games, and so I played it like quickly, and it was cool. And so we quickly kind of put together a mini unit on dialogue choices and how effective the game's use of dialogue choices are in pushing the narrative forward. And that wouldn't have happened if I didn't ask my students what they think could be a cool unit or what game I should use. So yeah, ask your students; they might have some really cool ideas.
And I will say, if you have not played the second season of the Batman Telltale games, it is a banger.
I haven't
Because
actually, so
oh
one
boy,
day.
I literally just finished it like a week ago, and not to derail it, but the relationship between Batman, Bruce Wayne, the Joker, and Harley Quinn is such an interesting dynamic that I haven't seen, and I'm not super familiar with the genres of Batman, but it's such an interesting twist to everything that I think it's almost required reading slash playing slash interpreting. Um, but I don't want to get too in the weeds on that. But yeah, that's an awesome way. Like, and I really
Well,
like
but that I think there's also something to be said for. I was talking before about using something you may not always have thought of as a content connection. I mean, how interesting would it be to use a Batman game to then lead into a discussion about the responsibilities of the rich in a society where crime reigns supreme? You could get into some big stuff there, and you did it with Batman. That's awesome.
Yeah, lots of themes. So our last little bookend before we start giving you loads of examples is something that I started doing the past year is live your life and then also pocket ideas that you think of as you're playing games or afterwards, like when you have time to debrief. I originally started doing this with Netflix videos that I'm like, oh, they're using math. I'm going to write this down and use it as an example in the future. Especially with Jessica Jones season 2, she was doing circles, which is pretty much construction. So future students, we're going to talk about this in the fall, where she kind of figured out the location of a character based on geographic mapping. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. And, we all play games. We all enjoy our lives outside the classroom. So identifying those as you're just living your life, put it in a notebook, put it in a little email to yourself so you have it for later so you can find it again, sprinkle it in, and then build on it as the years go on. So I thought that was just an important thing to bring up. Like Zach already said, he plays a lot of video games. So why not use your time having fun while also sprinkling in your educational spin to it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go to buttloads of examples. I thought maybe because we have over 35 in our little side thing, so I think maybe we'll do a couple from each category, and then if we have time, we can backtrack to any others. So we'll start with math because math is awesome. So one of the topics that I think is a no-brainer in terms of games and math is probability, because most games of chance or most games have some sort of probability angle that you can approach. For my game theory class, we did a unit of only probability, and it culminated with a project that they had to analyze one of their favorite video games in the lens of probability. So a lot of students, I don't know if there was a Pokemon Emerald craze, but a lot of them chose Pokemon Emerald, a lot of them chose Fortnite. So they had to research those probabilities and then decide how it's going to impact their gaming. So a lot of students didn't realize how rare certain rare items were in Fortnite. So when they got them, they felt even more empowered. Be like, wow, like this is a one in, I don't remember the number, like 417 or something. So that really gets them thinking not only about the game that they're playing, but also about how it's being made or how people play it in that lens. So I thought that was a really good thing. And in terms of the Pokemon angle, that can tier way between seventh grade probability and high college low probability, where it includes disjunction, conjunction, summations, at least phrases, at most phrases, exactly phrases. So my math people know what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of options with that. And then the other topic I want to overlay before I let the socialists and the LA people talk is in terms of circles, because circles are everywhere. So a lot of times when you're throwing area of effect items, or if you're throwing a grenade or splatting something in Splatoon, it usually shows that circle. So it's a fun exercise to let students find games that involve that notion. Take a screenshot and then we explore like, okay, well, what is the area of effect? What is the radius? What is the area of that effect with the area formula? Which kind of leads me into like me and Adam also on the side play a D&D game, and we were talking about, okay, if my fireball has a radius of 40 feet, like how much space is that really going to tackle? So that was me getting super nerdy into that category. And you know, it's a great opportunity to not only geek out about what you like, but it could bring into light activities that you enjoy that students might not even know exist. And it gets them involved into a whole world of concepts that they didn't even know. So I thought those are two good concepts. The last one I'll say, because I don't want to derail too much, but is about parabolas, which I jokingly said with Assassin's Creed. But just like the area of effect items, a lot of games show you that parabola feature. So if you take a screenshot, overlay it on a graph, you can do a regression on the parabola, and then students can identify it, talk about jumps and stuff like that. I think it's a really, those three things are usually my go-to if I teach algebra or geometry, in terms of getting those students involved in those. Mm-hmm. All right, so now let's talk about social studies examples. I know both of you have experience with that concept, so I'll let you guys run wild on which ones you want to talk about first.
Well, I've got an entire page of social studies lessons on my website, Hey Listen Games. The ones that I've used the most myself, I use Papers, Please and the Republic Times pretty much every year now at some point. Papers, Please is a great game for teaching about refugee crises and immigration. It puts you in the shoes of a border patrol agent in a fictional country, deciding who can come into your country, and it's like a puzzle game where you're just examining documents like passports, work papers, licenses, and you stamp yes or no to let them in. It's always a blast in my classroom because all of my students are immigrants, so it's very interesting seeing who decides to follow all the rules 100% and who's like super empathetic is like, nope, everyone can come in, and it just like gets these great debates going every single time. It's just one of the best lessons of the year. I'd spoken about Republia Times when I was still a world history teacher. I used Valiant Hearts: The Great War when I was teaching about World War One. It's a great game made by Ubisoft.
Love that game.
Specifically, like it has primary resources and nonfiction items like embedded into it. It was made in collaboration with a couple of museums, I think. So it was just like really cool to play that and have students examine like the different items that you pick up as you go along. This year I used the game Donut County. It's an indie game. It's a puzzle game where you basically just control a hole in the ground and you just like swallow up towns and you get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a super cute 2.5 hour game. But the game was specifically made as a metaphor for gentrification in Los Angeles. And I was teaching about gentrification in New York City this year. So after spending a week talking about gentrification, we then played the game and had them like discuss how it was represented in the game, right? So like I said, it was just, I did not use this game to teach what gentrification is. They had already had the background knowledge, and then they just discussed how it was portrayed in the game. So it's like things like that, right? So it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to look like the content, right? It's a really cute, adorable puzzle game. But there are ways to use things that you wouldn't normally think of. Life is Strange. I've used Gone Home. Another great one. Gone Home, like Harry mentioned, required games. Gone Home is a required game. Everyone needs to play Gone Home at some point. Like it's not even a
Fantastic.
question. It's also a great game to start off with because it's just a walking sim. You just walk around the house, pick up items, tons of text to read in the game, and so the mechanics are pretty simple for students to learn and grapple with. And I use that in a social studies unit. I don't want to say which one because I don't want to spoil anything.
Hmm.
Because if I tell
Excellent.
you which unit it was in, I'm going to spoil part of the game. So go
Yeah.
play the
So
game.
yeah, if you play the game, you'll know exactly what Zach is talking about.
Yeah. Also, when I was doing um, in U.S. history, teaching about Native Americans, there's a wonderful game called Never Alone, and it's made by Native Alaskan storytellers, right? And it's an entire game focused on. Well, it's an indie game, like 3 hours again, based on Native Alaskan folklore. And so I know a lot of teachers struggle finding getting kids getting kids who are not indigenous, right, to connect with Native Americans because many of them have never met one before in their life. And I found that this was a great way to get my students, uh, especially my students who are new to the country, who don't really know that Native Americans exist, um, learning about them and then interacting with them in this game, especially because the game has like documentary clips, like live action of the people speaking about the things that you're finding and doing in the game. So it's really a remarkable game that more people should play. And a fun one I did was I actually this takes more prep time, but I used Super Mario Odyssey
Mm.
to talk about how culture is represented in the game since it borrows from like places all around the world and often in sometimes stereotypical ways. So it's cool to see how students reacted to the ways that culture is represented in Super Mario Odyssey.
That's very interesting.
I could go on and on, but I know that
Yeah.
we're approaching the 1 hour time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we have about 2 minutes, so I think we might rapid fire some of the ones we mentioned. One thing I will say is future Harry has already made a Google Slides of all this information. So
Mhm.
Harry probably already sent the link down here already. So if you just want to click and open that, that'll give you all the information that we've talked about. So some other
Uh,
things that we have. Oh,
I was just going to say another, just another thing to remember is that uh, even if you aren't in a position where you can use tabletop games in your classroom, there are tabletop simulators and a lot of free accounts that you can do with Board Game Arena and things like that, and play games like We're Doomed, which is a quick little 15-minute game that you have to get off the planet using different styles of government, or Lords of Waterdeep, which is it's based in a D&D world, but is resource management, worker placement, and can really teach students a lot about scarcity and governmental decision making.
nice.
I'm
So
teaching I'm teaching Gov next year, so I'm looking into Weird Dooms
yes,
as we
it's
speak.
great.
I'm looking it up.
I highly recommend it.
It's so good. It's
Uh,
so good.
so now in terms of science, we have the Portal series. If you want to do evolution or climate change, you could do Beyond Blue. If you're in terms of technology, Nintendo Labo is a fantastic resource. So at this point, if you buy it on clearance, do it. If not, it's a great after-school activity that to get students engaged. In terms of students creating, Dreams is fantastic. Can be super high concept, so I would recommend that to upper level high school students. But I just started playing Game Builder Garage, which is Nintendo's newest um, introduction to mini programming. So far it looks really good, but I'm still very much early on. In
for
terms of
for
world,
for creating, I would just want to throw in Fortnite Creative
mm,
because it's super in depth now, lots and lots and lots and lots of tools, and it's free, and a lot of our students are already well versed in how to play Fortnite.
excellent.
And
Um,
as in relation to that, you may also want to think about Roblox
Roblox,
Creator.
Minecraft, yeah, all both of those also.
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So I think we're right at near the end. So let's kind of give everyone the additional resources. So Zach, if you could just remind us what your website is again.
Sure. So my website is heylistengames.org. I have a ton of curriculum up there. It's got to be like 45 different individual lessons and then two full like 30-day units that I've taught, from social studies to ELA to social emotional learning. If you have an advisory class, those, even if you have like, find a way to do SEL lessons because they resonate a lot with students, and I think it's needed more often. Um, I've got a couple of science lessons, not too much math because I all the stuff on the website currently is mine, and I don't teach math, so I don't know the content myself. Maybe
We'll
one
see if
day
I can sprinkle some in.
maybe
Yeah.
we'll see if we get some math content there in the future.
Mhm.
But it's there. I have a blog on the website where I talk about my experience teaching with games or providing my rationale whenever I put a new activity on the website. I'm gonna do a quick little plug, right? Everything on my website is free. I don't want teachers paying for things because teachers are underpaid a lot, so it is all free. If you can support, I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/HeyListenGames. If you would like to support, even if it's just $1 a month, it's perfectly, completely up to you. But yes, it is all free. I originally created the website to be a starting point for people who want to teach with video games but don't know where to start.
Excellent. And it's a great resource for everyone. Adam, what is your contact info in case anyone wants to reach out to you on Twitter?
I am at Mills WHHS on
Excellent.
Twitter and Instagram.
Nice. And I am at Ill Grill Chill on all my media platforms. So thank you so much, guys. I know we can probably talk about this for an almost infinite amount of time, but I hope some of you got some information for this. I hope you've learned something. I hope you gotten inspired to implement games into your classroom. And like I mentioned, we'll have that Google Slides down in there for reference if you need anything else. Until next time, have a great day and all the best of luck. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.